that the sanctuary filled up a little bit more because of the nature of my talk today in a minute. But I want to start by asking you a very important question. Do you attend church on a regular basis, or is it more like just every now and then when there isn't anything better to do? Now I know I'm preaching to the choir today because you're all here. And the ones that really probably need to hear this are probably somewhere else. But I wanted to talk about it anyway because it's something that Arlene shared with me last Sunday. She doesn't know I'm doing this. I didn't give permission after the anniversary service. But she said something, that really touched my heart. She said, I'm feeling kind of sad because I'm the only person at UCCM who's been here the entire 17 years. And it led us into a discussion about how in today's day and age and culture, it's becoming less and less popular to go to church. Have you noticed that? So many other things are pulling our attention away. It's funny, when even driving here this morning with my mom came to Unity this morning, we drove by a stadium, I think it's on Chandler Street. That was, the road was filled with cars, and I said, wow, something's happening here. And you could see that there were some games that were about to begin. How many of you were old enough to remember where nothing used to happen on Sunday mornings? No stores were closed, were open. Can you believe that? The younger people? Nothing happened on Sunday morning except for what? Church. Yeah, people went to be with their spiritual communities. A lot has changed. And I know a lot of the reasons why people don't go to church. Some of them are very good reasons, and I could spend this morning talking about that, delving into the change in culture, but what I wanted to do instead was to focus on the primary reason that I think it's still a good spiritual practice to come to church. Halford Luckett, a noted scholar, noticed a significant correlation between physical and spiritual immunity. In medicine, a person can develop immunity against a disease by receiving a very mild dose of that disease. You've all heard of that, right? Well, the same thing can be experienced by the soul. If a person receives nothing more than a small dose of spirituality, they may develop an immunity against the very thing, spirituality, that can change their lives. Think about it. Leslie Weatherhead affirmed this concern when he said, the trouble with some of us is that we have been inoculated with small doses of spirituality, which keep us from catching the real thing. So there's danger, in a way, to our spiritual development to approach our spiritual practice in a haphazard way, a hit or miss kind of way, every now and then kind of way, because then we're just getting those small doses, right? And we're getting immunized to the fullness of what spirituality can be in our lives, in our consciousness, in our unfoldment. One way to gauge whether you've been immunized or not is to ask yourself, when I think about who I am, do I focus on my personality or on my spiritual identity? How do you define yourself? Somebody said, who are you? Would you answer, I'm BJ, I'm 54 years old, I've got an ache in my hip here. Or would you say, I'm a child of God, endowed with unlimited potential and possibility? How would you answer that question? Yes, my personality is a part of me, but there's something much greater, right? In me. do we say? A spiritual being having a human experience. I'm more than just flesh and blood. I'm what? I'm spirit. Clothed temporarily in clothes that I may not even like that much. So I love this. You know, until I truly see myself as more than my personality, till that happens, if and only when that happens, am I going to start to allow my spiritual nature to show up in everything I do and everything I am. Not just every now and then. I want to turn to scripture for a minute, to the Apostle Paul. You know him? You know, the guy who wrote a lot of the letters in the New Testament, a lot of what we call the epistles. Well, one time he was in Athens, Greece, and he got pretty upset with what he saw there. Let me read to you from the book of Acts, chapter 17, verses 16 and 17 and 22 through 30. Now, while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols. What do you think some of our idols today might be? Soccer games, money, Facebook, no, I don't know. Whatever you put before God, whatever's more important that you have to be at right now. Of course, you're all here, I'm preaching to the choir. Okay. So he got provoked as he saw that the city was full of idols. So he argued in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. And so Paul, standing in the middle of the Areopagus, said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you're very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you." What you're about to hear is something that I'm going to ask you to do later. Paul knew what he believed in, right? He knew the foundation of his faith. So he goes, "For therefore you worship, therefore you worship is unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by man, nor is God served by human hands, as though God needed anything. Since God gives to all humans life and breath and everything, and God made from one ancestor every nation of humans to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their habitation, that they should seek God in hope that they might feel after God and find God." You getting this? This is the point of why we're here. Regardless of where you're living, where your habitation is, it's all that they should seek God in hope that they might feel after God and find God. Yet God is not far from each one of us, he says. For in God we live and move and have our being. Is that one of our favorite verses? So he's saying, for in God we live and move and have our beings. As even some of your poets have said, for we are indeed God's offspring. Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the deity is like gold or silver or stone, a representation by the art and the imagination of man. The times of ignorance God overlooked. So he's like saying, kids, the time of not knowing God is overlooked, being ignorant. But now God commands all people everywhere to repent. Breathe. True students, what does repent mean? Change your mind. God commands people everywhere to change and rise up and to start thinking differently. about spirituality. So this morning I'm going to give you a test of faith. Are you ready?
Ready.
You're not going to get graded on it. I'm going to ask you a series of 10 questions that you're going to take a moment and answer for yourselves and see how you measure up. Are you an every now and then kind of person? As far as your spiritual practice? Or are you spiritually developed and maturing and coming into a solid foundation of your faith in what you believe? You'll know after this if you're just getting that occasional dose of spirituality, which is not getting you anywhere. Believe me. And perhaps it's time then for you to put a regular spiritual practice into place. Whether that, it might be coming to church. This isn't about you have to come to church every Sunday. But what are you doing? Not only weekly, but daily for a spiritual practice. Are you praying? Are you meditating? Are you in a group of meditators, a meditation group? Are you going to any classes to study the truth principles? What is your spiritual practice that you're committed to? It's not like, I don't have anything better to do, so I guess I'll go to Bible class. Think about it. So you ready for the test?
Sure.
Well, question number 1 is, can you put your belief about God into words? Can you put your belief about God into words? Now, it's not difficult to profess faith in God, especially on Sunday morning when we're all here in this supportive environment called unity. But what kind of God do you believe in the other 6 days of the week? How would you explain your idea of God to another person who doesn't come to the Unity Church? Can you do it? You see, at some point in our spiritual development, we have to ask ourselves, can I put my profession of faith into words? Do I have a creed? What do I believe? I've talked to you about writing your credo before. What spiritual principles do I live by, work by, stand by? Not easy questions, right? But it's vital to one's spiritual development to take this test of faith. This test to articulate what it is that you believe and why. I can get up here every week and tell you what it is that I believe and why. And the occasional churchgoer gets exactly that, what I believe and why. But what's really important is, what do you believe and why? So question number 2. Do you live as though what you believe is true? Do you live your beliefs? It's one thing to profess a faith and quite another to practice it. Yes? And that's what unity is based on, the practical application of these truth principles. To live as though one's beliefs are true. I have to ask myself, how much of my faith is just a mere verbalization of words without any real meaning? I don't even know what they mean. I just have memorized what I'm supposed to say. There's one presence and one power in the universe and in my life, God the good, omnipotent. And I'm going to say, well, what does that mean? Does that mean that there's an opposing power called Satan or the devil? Is there hell? Some of you can answer that right away. No, BJ. It means there's only one presence and one power. God the good. Others are like, huh? There's no Satan? Are you every now and then? Or do you know the answers? For you, do you know what you believe in and why? Do you even know that if you're in the right church as far as our theology? No, I'm waiting for fellowship. I think they're going to have cake today. I don't know. We come for different reasons. How much is my life a living testament to my beliefs? For example, the spiritual principle of tithing is a test of real belief. You get that? You either believe it or you don't. If you read about Jesus Christ carefully, you'll see over and over again, he said to people, think about what I'm teaching you. You know, a great example of this is the Lord's Prayer. When he taught the Lord's Prayer, he said to them to not just recite it, but to think about what it means. What are we doing in most churches now? Reciting the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy will be done. He said, don't just recite it. What does it mean? He was teaching us how to pray. He said, this is how you pray. And then he did a series of 7 affirmations, and he taught us the way in which to pray. Not to memorize the prayer and recite it over and over again for over 2,000 years. Think about it. William James once suggested that the average religious believer had a religion made for him by others, communicated to him by tradition, determined to fix forms by imitation, and retained by habit. Get it? And a wonderful example of this is a story about a little boy that lived on a farm with his grandfather. And the grandfather had a herd of rams. These rams were in a caged area. And he called the boy over one day and he said, I want you to watch what's going to happen now. It's a life's lesson. He called the first ram over, and the first ram jumped over the gate. And then the grandfather said to the boy, watch this. And he opened the gate so it was no longer in the way of the rams. But every ram followed the first ram by what? Jumping over the gate. And it was no longer there. He said, son, throughout your whole life, I want you to think about what you're doing and why. I want you to think about what you're believing and why. This is so important, folks. My faith to be alive has to be alive in me. It has to be an individual, personal practice that I'm committed to. Finding God myself in the depth of myself. First I have to know what it is I believe, right? Then I have to live what I believe. You following? How you doing on the test? Question number 3. Does your faith meet your need in times of crisis? Or are you a fair weather believer? You know, it's easy to have faith and conviction and assurance when I'm riding the crest of good fortune, right? But the faith that really matters is the kind that guides me through the valleys, through those dark nights of the soul, that sustain me and assure me and build me up. So I have to figure out, are my beliefs stabilizers in both my times of triumph and my times of tragedy? I can't tell you how many people leave this church, leave the unity movement, leave many other religious traditions when the storms begin. Might have happened to you at one point in your life. I remember when I was a young person, I was Episcopalian, I went to church every single day for 35 years. But I don't think it was the Gulf War. When we went to war, first time in my life, because I was a little bit young for Vietnam. We were in Vietnam, but I wasn't conscious of it. First time as a young adult, we went to war, and I became so disillusioned I didn't go to church for maybe 2 years. So this happens to us, right? Everything makes sense until it doesn't. You know? And then you're like, my beliefs are not working here. I don't understand this. So I'll stop going. But just as steel is tempered by plunging it into cold water while it's red hot, I've learned that I too will be immeasurably strengthened by true solid faith in my times of trial by fire. What about you? Question number 4. This is the one that kind of relates to church. Do you have specific, stated times for your spiritual development? You know, I sometimes call it appointments with God. But it's getting to your spiritual practice, whatever it is, if it's daily meditation and prayer, if it's going to church on Sundays, if it's being a part of that meditation group that meets on Thursdays, is that as important and essential to you as being on time for work every day? Or being right there to answer the phone when your loved one calls? The one that makes your heart go pit-patter? Would you miss that? Would you miss the date with that person? What would it mean if God was your beloved? That you would never even consider standing up for something that comes around that seems a little better. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go on Facebook and see how the teens post about their loved ones, the ones that they're in love with this day. Most important thing, right? Is God the most important appointment of your day, of your week, your spiritual practice, if you don't like the word God? I know faith cannot be put into a box, and spirituality cannot be restricted to certain areas and special hours, but the fact is, folks, that people of great faith have always set aside specific, stated times for their spiritual practice. There's a quote from Martin Luther who said, "If I have 6 hours of work to do, I spend 2 hours in prayer." Do you get that? Charles Fillmore, the co-founder of Unity, spent 4 hours a day in meditation to bring us the teachings that we are now studying at this Unity Church. 4 hours a day. We cannot develop our spiritual lives the way we remodel our homes. I cannot call in an expert to draw up plans and then engage someone else to do the work for me. Nor can I move out while this process is going on and then come back when it's all done and finished. You know, I might get some suggestions and advice, but who has to do the work? I have to do the work. I have to do it myself. And to do it, I have to set aside, in my busy schedule, all the things of my personality that draw my attention away. I have to set specific, stated times and keep them. They're not something I would scratch up, just like I wouldn't say, well, I'm not going to go to work today because this came up. This seems a little bit better, although we know that. Do you ever see them when they get caught on TV? They're at a Red Sox game or really sick and they call in sick to work? They're so happy they don't really even care at that moment. That's question number 4. Question number 5. Is your home life better because of your faith and spiritual beliefs? Someone once said, when a person gets religion, even his dog and cat ought to see the improvement. Now, for you pet people, you don't like that. Because, you know, they're just as important as everybody else. But it's kind of saying, you know, there shouldn't be a member of your family that doesn't feel the presence of your faith and your beliefs. Spiritual development should build a happier life, folks. I can rate my faith and my beliefs by asking myself, does my attitude at home contribute to or hinder the atmosphere of happiness, mutual respect, love? Do I properly reflect in the interactions with my family members the deep convictions of the faith that is mine? Or is it simply, again, an issue of hit or miss? It depends on how I feel today, if I'm going to practice my spiritual beliefs or express and live my spiritual beliefs. Question number 6, does your faith give you a sense of companionship even in solitude? Think about it. You know, Americans are accused, in a sense, of being a people that cannot stand being alone. Will do anything to escape being alone. What are some things we do to escape being alone? TV, computer, music, drugs, alcohol, Facebook, whatever. I have to always put my addiction out there, right? Sleeping, anything to not be alone. Anything. But let me ask you, let's say you're in a house all by yourself and the electricity goes out. There's no TV, no computer, no radio, and my goodness, you forgot to buy some matches. So you can't even light a candle, and it's early evening, it's dark out, so you can't read a book, you can't read a magazine, there's nothing to do.
I got a flashlight.
I forgot about that. No flashlights can be found because it's too dark. What are you going to do?
Go to bed.
Well, that's in the language. She said, pray for the lights to come back up. But how many of you would even think, wow, this is a time to enter the silence, to be in solitude with God. Thank you, God, what an opportunity. Because your belief gives you that foundation, you have constant companionship. You're never, ever alone. How do you rate in this respect? For a person is never less alone than when he or she is with God. Did you hear that? You are never less alone. Now, people who always have to be busy or with other people are going to have to take a moment to take that in. You're never less alone than when you are in the presence of God. Question number 7, does your faith play an important part in your job and at your workplace? Does that mean you have to be a minister? No. Well, I'd like you to be, but no. Why do I want you to be? Anybody have any idea about that? Why would I would like you to be a minister?
Spread the truth. Spread the good news.
Yeah, that's good. Spread the good news. You dedicate your life to God. Does that mean you have to be at a pulpit in a church? No. God is number one, numero uno in your life. That's why. There's an old saying, work is worship. You know, I have to ask myself, of what use is my spirituality if it does not provide me with a usable philosophy in my job? If it doesn't work in your job, it's not real. You know, I think this, when I was thinking about this, it brought to mind, I used to work for 22 years in social services, and some of you know that I worked for maybe 9 of those years with battered women in a battered women's program. I was a program coordinator or whatever. And one day I was at the shelter. I would go over and supervise the workers over there and see how they were doing. And I remember this particular evening where I was observing one of the shelter workers. And as the many women and children, I think we could have up to 7 or 8 families in the shelter at one time. When they finished eating, they piled up all their dishes to be washed, and this lone shelter worker stood quietly with her arms immersed, in the sudsy water, and listened to a troubled woman pour out her woes. And the worker listened intently while methodically washing plate after plate. And I really marveled at her patience and acceptance of such an unending, thankless chore. And I asked her afterwards, how do you do it? How do you do this day after day? Not only having to do the chores and help out with the chores in the household, but always being available to whoever at any given moment wants you to listen to them and to tell you their problems and troubles. And she looked at me and she smiled. She knew I was very religious back then. Everybody knew it. I used to wear crosses all the time, and at the shelter I was told, Arlene knows this, that I shouldn't wear crosses because it upsets people. And we had this big thing about I have to. At that stage in my life I felt that I had to wear that. It was part of my identity. So everybody knew how religious I was. So she felt comfortable to share with me. She said, I just imagine when I'm doing these dishes, all these plates, day after day, that I'm dipping my hands in the pool of Bethesda. Now you have to know your Bible to know what she was talking about. Bethesda was a pool of healing waters that people would go and try and dip their hand into. But what she was saying to me was that by focusing her attention on stirring up God's healing waters, she did her daily chores with serenity, cultivating a listening ear and being able to offer restorative care with ease. Do you hear that? Any of you know Brother Lawrence? He was the same way. He was a monk that was in charge of washing all the pots and pans, and he wrote this little book called Practicing the Presence. No matter where you are, you can be living your beliefs, practicing the presence of God. So how are you showing up in your workplace? Question number 8, has your faith ever inspired you to do a good deed? One of the most rewarding acts is to give without any expectation of getting in return. Clerk in a supermarket tells the story. She plans down the long line waiting at the cash register she was operating at the supermarket, and she said silently to herself, it's not I, but the Christ within that does the work. And she prayed and thought about the message of her church and how she was told in every instant to ask herself, how would the Christ within me handle this particular problem? My higher self, my God self. You know that's the Christ within, right? So she scanned a loaf of bread, and she said, that'll be $3.09. And there was a small boy in front of her in his fistfuls. He had 2 fistfuls full of pennies. And he dumped them on the counter. And as he did this, she heard the others in the line say, I thought this was the express line. Why do I always pick the wrong line? It's going to take her all day to count that kid's pennies. And she counted every one of the pennies, and he was short 28 cents. And she gave him an uneasy look, and his cheeks turned pink, and then she asked herself, what would Jesus, the Christ, do? Right? In this situation. And she quickly picked up the receipt and scribbled on it, I owe this register 28 cents. And she slipped it into the register along with the boy's pennies, and she pressed a paid sticker on the bread and handed it to him. And his eyes brightened, and he said, thank you, ma'am. And the disgruntled complaints of the waiting customers no longer made her nervous. She said, my heart felt light. It didn't just last that minute, it lasted the whole day. Remember the teaching of Paul. In God you live and move and have your being. You and I are the living presence of God in every situation. How are you doing in this area? Question number 9. Does your faith command your deepest loyalties? Does it? Meister Eckhart said, the eye with which I see God is the same eye with which he sees me. This means our highest loyalty should be our recognition of our oneness with God. That's what you're most loyal to, nothing else. St. Francis de Sales, not of Assisi, said, remain either in God or close to God without trying to do anything and without asking anything of God in return. You know, I have to ask myself in all the circumstances of my life, am I putting God first? Am I keeping my appointments with God? Am I praying and meditating and studying and praising God each and every opportunity I get? How deep is my deepest loyalties to the one power and the one presence reigning in my life? Do I ever, or perhaps even frequently, put God second? I think it's that soccer game. And finally, one more question. In the test of faith, question number 10. Is the world different because of your faith? Is the world different because of your faith? If spirituality does not change our world, I'm telling you, it's very likely that it hasn't changed you either. When I walk through life with faith, I have what is commonly called a consciousness of the presence of God. I look beyond and within things in a new way. Do you get that? I see the world in a new way when I'm living my faith. Even when unexplainable events confront me, such as war, terror, death, I see God's way of dealing with these circumstances in my not-so-yet-perfect world. When I see God's way, I'm going to deal with things of this world differently. With a strength and a courage that I of myself would not have. And the world's going to, guess what? Stand up and take notice. Do we have to go and knock on people's doors and drag them to church? What do we teach in Unity? You are the shining example of the truth principles being alive and well and making a difference. So that is the test of faith. It's about living my faith in a new and fuller way. And it's my prayer that we in this laboratory of faith that we call Unity join together to test our own personal faith. That we join together here weekly to know God. Yes, for each person, that knowing is a little bit different, slightly different, but we will each know what we believe and why we believe it. It's the only way, folks, that God will ever be truly real to you and real to me. So let's stand and join together in singing the song, Seek Ye First the Kingdom of God.